With our last few videos being focused on some more mainstream titles, I thought it would be fun to cover something a bit less well known this time around. Poking around the GOG store, I was leaning towards another dungeon crawler, in the more traditional style of Lands of Lore or the Gold Box Classics, and was looking into the Might and Magic series of games. In my search, this game caught my eye. The marketing on the sale page was giving me such Dark Souls meets Fable meets discount bin vibes, and I was all for it. Still a dungeon crawler, but instead of a more traditional first-person perspective, it employed a third-person and looked more action-focused. The reviews weren't great, but I like to decide for myself, so I decided to give the folks at GOG my hard-earned gold coins to see if this game deserves its less than favorable rating. Let's get into it.
A village at peace, but not for long, for tonight brings the scourge, the terror, and the madness of the horde known as the Legion of the Fallen. They are the heralds of death who attack by night, ravaging town after town with no mercy. Attack!
So as a bit of a disclaimer, and proof that I'm getting old and losing my memory, I have the faintest memory of this game from when I was younger. I mostly remember the cover artwork, and weirdly have a vague memory of the Duskwood section of the game. Everything else is a complete blur, so we can just say this is a blind playthrough. The title was developed by 3DO, a bit of an interesting developer. 3DO actually wasn't founded with software in mind. They actually got their start making consoles, specifically the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, a CD-based console released in 1993. That console unfortunately did not do too well, and the company instead moved on to developing video games, with their most notable releases being the Army Men games. Actually, a game that might be sort of fun to play on this channel another time. I remember playing the original Army Men and having countless hours of fun destroying the accursed tan soldiers. But I digress. We are here for the high fantasy of Might and Magic. Interestingly enough, Crusaders of Might and Magic has two separate release versions, one for the PS1 and one for the PC. While both are similar, it seems the story differs a fair bit. For this playthrough, I'll be playing the GOG version, which is derived from the PC release of the game. The general backstory on offer here is nothing special, but the campy, cliché nature of the story is a big part of the charm this game has. The game opens on a village at work, but before long the legions of the dead are descending on the village, killing everyone in sight. These undead are in the thrall of Necros, this game's main antagonist and a powerful necromancer. The attack on the village is mostly successful, killing all but one. A small boy named Drake survives, and fueled by the rage and sorrow of having his home destroyed, spends the next years of his life learning to dispatch and destroy the undead. Drake is so successful at hunting the denizens of the night that he gains a name for himself and becomes a bit of a legend in his own right. Unfortunately, his ego is his downfall, and he's captured during a skirmish with the undead. And that's all the backstory we get. It's thin, but it's more than enough to get us ready for some high fantasy adventuring in the land of Ardon. I feel the gameplay of Crusaders is somehow simultaneously very familiar and also quite unique. It truly doesn't do anything too different than other games in a similar vein, but it does a decent job of mixing everything together in a way that is generally enjoyable. For combat, you're going to mostly be fighting enemies in melee, with a pretty standard roster of weapons and equipment. The most interesting weapons I found were a wrist-mounted spear launcher and a boomerang axe. Both make for unique tactical choices, but are not really all that useful just due to the low damage outputs. Your staple for damage are going to be pretty standard weapons like swords and maces. It's not a bad thing, but it would have been cool to see some more unique weapons on offer. In terms of how combat plays out, the game manual makes it seem as though rolling and dodging will be your primary means of avoiding damage, but I found this to be generally janky as hell and ineffective. Blocking, on the other hand, is supremely effective against the majority of enemies you'll face. Once you get into a good rhythm of block, strike, block, Most single enemies won't pose a big threat. For larger groups, it's just a matter of abusing the pathfinding. If you just keep backing up, you can pretty well always get your enemies to come at you in a single file. There are some larger enemies that can break right through your block, but they usually don't appear in numbers, and by the time you're encountering them regularly, you'll have spells capable of counteracting any threat they pose. The spell system itself is pretty basic, but there are actually an impressive number of spells on offer. The game lets you cast spells without breaking up the melee action, so you can be just like the guy on the cover art, hurling fire and swinging a sword without missing a beat. You have the basics early on, like Fireball and Lightning Bolt, and you'll find utility spells like Stone Skin, Light, and Lifesteal. There's even a spell late game used only in cutscenes, though you can cast it outside those cutscenes if you feel like it. Probably the two most valuable spells are granted late game and trivialize most encounters. The first is Freeze. It does what it says, but it's so useful as it creates a freezing zone that you yourself are immune to, meaning that you can create a zone that will stop all enemies in their tracks and then take your time picking them off one by one while they're helpless. It's not even an expensive spell. By the time you get it, you can pretty well cast it non-stop. Next in the overpowered spell slot, we have the Raise Spirit spell, which grants you a spectral warrior to fight alongside you. This companion does surprisingly high damage, is tanky, and will take aggro from enemies. Again, the mana cost is so low that you can keep 100% uptime on the spell if you want to. The only downside to this spell is that kills by your companion won't grant experience. But really, by that point in the game, you'll be plenty strong already. Outside these combat mechanics, there are also usable items. You have things like elemental resistance potions and speed potions, but I really didn't see much need to use these. Most elemental damage you take is very minor, and the speed potions have such a short duration, I quite honestly couldn't be bothered most of the time. You have healing and mana potions to top it off. These are the only reliable way to heal, so you'll be chugging those throughout. The game has a pretty standard RPG economy. You have stores that can buy and sell items throughout. I enjoyed the variety of the stores. The game does have a lot of backtracking, but each milestone in the game would see the shops updated, so a subsequent visit would refresh the vendor inventories with new and interesting items. A great quality of life feature of the stores was the 100% refundability of items. By this, I mean that you can buy an item, and you can sell it back for the same price you bought it for. Meaning you could buy something, try it out, and if you don't like it, or are just finished with it, you can sell it back without actually losing any money. It seems small, but I cannot overstate how annoyed I get with the modern day RPG trope where an item will be listed for a certain amount of gold, but you only get a lesser amount when selling. I mean, it's realistic I guess, but I still hate it. The story here is pretty thin as stated, but the game progresses like an RPG might. You talk to people, who tell you to talk to other people, who in turn, big surprise here, tell you to talk to other people. But I guess if you've made it this far, you're probably more interested in hearing someone talk to you about the story in the game. So let's do that. The story opens up right where our cutscene ended. Two undead have just dragged you into a cell, but they're more concerned with a dice game than actually making sure your cell is locked, and it costs them their undead lives. Karma for being inattentive prison guards and playing when they should be working. Goddamn slackers. Leaving the cell, if we intentionally go the wrong way, there is a shadow we can fight. But more interestingly, there is a very blurry photo hidden in one of the cells. I presume this is a developer Easter egg. I love finding this kind of thing in a game. Always gives the game a bit of soul. Anyhow, going the correct way, we find an imprisoned Crusader. We let him go, and he sets us off to find Celestia, the leader of the Crusaders. We get out of the stronghold and make our way to the Crusader base, a place called the Citadel, a floating rock city in the sky. Very cool and very fantasy. Celestia doesn't mince words. She wants to stop Necros, and to do that, she's going to need the Horn of Shattering from the dwarves. The horn will let us breach the main gate of Necros' stronghold. She dubs us a Crusader, and we're off. In order to reach Caranthia, city of the dwarves, we need to travel through the Duskwood, and to reach the Duskwood, we need to go through the Catacombs. Our first dungeon crawl. The dungeon is pretty standard, lots of skeletons throughout, and we come across our first rock elemental here. This early in the game, we don't have much in the way of magic to help us with conquering this thing, and I am vile at dodging. I found the best approach here is to cut in close and just spam the attack. Against a single elemental, this is pretty reliable, and can stunlock them until they eventually explode in a very dramatic fashion. Toward the end of the catacombs, we come to a big platforming section. This part is absolutely vile. The jumps are not precise in this game. You jump weirdly high, but not very far forward. It's very floaty, and the movement on the ground, while serviceable, is not good at fine detail movement. So near edges, you tend to just fly off. There's also a strange problem with what I can only assume are invisible walls in the game, so you'll often jump and hit your head on some unknown force, completely stopping your forward momentum and plunging you to your death. These platforming sections are not common at all. In fact, this may be the only one. Unfortunately, throughout the campaign, we will be back through this section 3 times. Ugh. Out of the catacombs, we move through the Duskwood. This area is surprisingly much easier than the catacombs. The enemies here are dashers, some sort of tribalistic insect-type race. They are fast but squishy, and unlike the Legion skeletons have no magic attacks, so everything they do is blockable. Also in the woods are giant fat ginger men with receding hairlines. I thought these were some sort of highwaymen at first, but apparently they're classified as ogres. I guess if you're fat and balding, you're considered an ogre in this universe. I feel attacked, 3DO. Anyhow, they're pretty easy as well. Despite being somewhat large, they are fully blockable and easy to deal with. Reaching Carantha, I'm very pleasantly surprised the city is visually really interesting to look at. Stoneworked homes and shops, an inn, the mines, and a city hall building. Actually a really nicely designed little set piece. This is a nice step up from the other villages in the game. The village outside the citadel earlier was just a bunch of houses haphazardly placed in a valley, and the citadel itself was a mess of stairs and rock that mostly served to be confusing to navigate. My only real problem with this city is that these shrew brains decided to use a wooden bridge across the lava river running under their city. That has to be a health and safety violation. We meet up with the Dwarven Council to request the Horn of Shattering, but the Dwarf King has been killed and his heir captured in the civil uprising. The only way they can grant us the horn is by kingly approval, and to get that, we're gonna need a king. I guess Drake is firmly in the bourgeoisie, so we're off to break up the strike. We unceremoniously slaughter dwarven workers on our journey to the imprisoned prince. The whole experience culminates with a boss fight against a rock and a fire elemental. We still don't have much to make dealing with these big brutes easier, but lucky for us, the big one keeps getting fresh with the little one, allowing us to divide and conquer. I'll take the win. We get the prince free and back to his council room. He says he'll grant us the horn, but his bureaucrat advisors let us know that he'll need to be king to actually give it to us. And he is just a prince. Apparently, to officially become a king, he needs some sort of kingly scepter that was stolen by the ogres. Yeah, I mean, people are being mercilessly slaughtered by the undead, but yeah, let me go get your golden scepter for you. I'm sure it's really important. God, I hate the ruling class. Anyhow, we get his stick and he finally grants us the horn. Time for our first big backtrack to the Citadel. The game is kind enough to grant us respawned enemies for the trip back, and we get to do the catacomb platforming mess again. Back in the Citadel, there is no fanfare, not even a thank you. Celestia immediately informs us that her favorite Crusader, Captain Ursan, went wandering into the glacier for unknown reasons. Apparently it is critical that we save him. Guess where the glacier is? On the opposite side of the catacombs, where we literally just came from. Guess who gets to do the platforming nonsense on the way back for a 3rd time? Spoiler alert, it's me. The most egregious part of this backtracking is that the game does occasionally use teleporting of the character for story reasons, so it could have just used some plot device to cut out this back-to-back catacomb section, but instead it's going to make me do the same platforming challenge for a 3rd time. Oh, and also, there was a random woman outside the catacombs that gave us the ability to see ghosts infecting and controlling people. No story explanation as to why this woman gave this to us, but it's cool, I suppose. Felt like a really ham-fisted way of giving us the ability to see those possessed, but there it is. At the glacier, we find the airship driver for the Crusaders. She lets us know that Ursan has been captured by frost giants and will need a rescue. Of course he will. Wait, hold on. There is an airship here. Aren't I on a quest to save the kingdom from an unspeakable evil? Why the hell can't I have an airship? That's not fair. Anyway, we infiltrate the lair of the frost giants, and have one of the more exciting rumbles in the game with a whole host of the icy behemoths. Turns out, frost giants really don't like having their flesh burned with fire, so we make good use of that. We free Ursan from his icy prison, and teleport instantly back to the airship. So I guess when it's for anyone but me, fast travel is fine. That's okay, I'm not at all bitter. Anyway, Ursan gives me a scroll to deliver to the dwarves. I guess there is to be a concentrated assault on Necros' stronghold. Fully ready to do the catacombs for the 4th time, I'm delighted to see that they've been avalanched on, and we take a different route to Duskwood. In the Duskwood, we're immediately stopped by a dasher possessed by one of those evil spirits from earlier. In its dying breath, he lets us know there's a counter to the spirits located back in the glacier. Dude, I just came from there. We can't catch a break. We head back literally to where we just were in the glacier, only now the frost giants are replaced with an undead legion. Nothing too much to say about them. A lot of bigger skeletons in the ranks can't be blocked, but we have freeze now and abuse it pretty heavily on those enemies. We find the entry to some sort of red dimension in the back of the cave. Strangely, the enemies within look shockingly similar to Celestia's elite guard. Suspicious. Funnily enough, I don't directly kill a single one of them. The walkway we fight on is so narrow, I just knock them off in a single hit. At the end, we get our ghost killing spell, and we head back to the Duskwood. Before we make it too far into the woods, we find a dasher blockade. They let us know their people have been heavily affected by these body-snatching wraiths, and offer us clemency if we can purge the ghosts from their people. Sure, why not? We cure the dashers, and to thank us, they let us use their shops. I buy a super disappointing spear launcher, and we finally make our way to the dwarves. We deliver the scroll, but apparently it's blank. Seems like Ursan and possibly Celestia just wanted us out of the way, but they're the ones that sent us on this quest in the first place. Very mysterious-like. Anyhow, with no further information, we need to get to wrecking up Necros' stronghold. We are able to finally make use of that horn to break through the stronghold door, and I have to say, I don't think I've ever been more disappointed by a cutscene in my life. We fight our way through the stronghold and eventually emerge on the other side where a whole army of dudes is waiting. Once again, way too late and no help. Everything is already dead. We meet up with our friendly neighborhood airship driver and she takes us up to Necros' own airship. Unlike our airship, his airship is red. That's how you know it's evil. The airship is rife with enemies, but nothing we haven't seen before. In the final chamber we come face to face with Necros himself. I actually went into this fight thinking he'd be invincible or have some sort of gimmick, even going so far as to try and hit some of these things on the wall. I mean, his whole shtick is that he is the immortal lord of the undead, and he has a big purple bubble around him that just screams, "I'm invincible." But surprisingly, he really is just a boss you hit until he dies. It's a bit of an anticlimax, but oh well. Still a neat design on his model. The game has a really bizarre ending, with you back on the ground and all of the people you've met on your journey there to debrief you. Like, just on a weird edge of a hill. Most of the debrief is done by the Dasher Chieftain, who isn't actually voice acted but just speaks in weird chirps and hisses. The Dwarven King is right there. Why not have the character with an actual voice deliver the exposition? More strange still, during this whole encounter, Drake actually mentions the Citadel as though he's in the Citadel. It's almost like this cutscene was supposed to take place elsewhere, but they just shoehorned it into the side of this hill. Anyhow, weird choice aside, apparently Celestia and her old guard Crusaders are missing, so instead of trying to find or rescue their leader, they instead appoint you to lead the Crusaders. Really loyal bunch, these guys. We also never get a resolution to the whole Ursan sending us away on a wild goose chase thing, or find out why Celestia's royal guards attacked us in the red zone. I suppose I've seen worse endings. So, unlike some of the other games I've reviewed, Crusaders did not receive a good reception. Most reviews put it average at best and awful at worst. I disagree with this assessment, but it's hard to escape the fact that Crusaders is a middling game. That said, the game does have some wonderful redeeming qualities, so I think having some debate on those qualities should prove interesting. The first review is from IGN, and it's actually from 1999, just after the game's release. This will just be a snippet from a much larger review. If you're interested in reading the whole thing, it can be found on IGN's website. At its worst, it's just an exercise in slamming on buttons. As you wander around the extremely narrow game world, you come into contact with wave after wave of increasingly big and well-armored dead things. You click on your joystick/keyboard buttons, and Drake swings his sword/hammer/axe, and they die. If you click too soon, you'll miss, and they'll hit you first. If you click too late, they'll hit you before you can swing. This sums up everything the game has to offer. There is certainly a lot to be critical of in this game, but this just reads incorrectly to me. The game is no more a button masher than Dark Souls is. I would argue that if you just run into every encounter and smash the attack button, you're generally not going to have a great time and will be chugging a hell of a lot of healing potions. The combat is relatively simple, but it's not a button masher at all. You need to master a block swing block to optimize your play. Does this get reused on most enemies? Sure, but it's also a short game. There are combo breakers to this usual gameplay loop in the bigger enemies and spellcasters, requiring clever use of spells and cover to defeat readily. On top of this, there's also ranged weapons, and if you're a better man than I, even a dodge system that can be used to come at combat encounters in a different way. Sure, this combat is not anything spectacular, but it is enjoyable and just complex enough to keep you engaged. It's just what it needed to be. From the GOG review site. Controls are clunky, storyline is non-existent, levels are awful. I picked this review because it's short, but it touches on just about everything worth mentioning in most of the negative reviews of the game. Firstly, controls. I would disagree with them being clunky. The game is customizable, you can set the controls however you'd like, and I would argue the game controls just fine, with the big exception being jumping and platforming. And outside the catacombs, you won't really be doing a lot of jumping anyhow. Storyline being non-existent is just factually incorrect. Is the storyline cliché and predictable? Sure. Is the voice acting terrible? Absolutely. But the story is there, and it does what it needs to do. It sets the stage for a simple and comfortable RPG adventure. Am I going to lose nights of sleep pondering the fate of Celestia and her Crusaders? No. But the story gave me more than enough of a loose motivation to push me from goalpost to goalpost. I played this game over the course of a couple of evenings after work, relaxing, with not too much to worry about while I worked my way through the adventure. I absolutely love a game with a good, rich story to dig into, but a game with just enough to get me to the next level is fine sometimes too. Sometimes you just want to turn your brain off and kill some skeletons, and the story here facilitated that wonderfully. Level design being bad is probably hard to argue. The game is mostly linear hallways with a lot of backtracking. It mostly worked for me, but I'll admit it wasn't exactly inspired. I think a mini-map would have been a big help here. The in-game map was admittedly practically useless. See, I can be agreeable if I really try. I came into this game mostly blind, and with the heavily negative reviews of the title, with fairly low expectations. I'll be the first to admit that a lot of those negative reviews have strong merit. This game is not a masterpiece. It has some glaring flaws with its level design and pacing, and a story that is pretty bare bones for an RPG. All that said, I really did enjoy my time playing Crusaders, and was actually quite disappointed when it ended. It was such an easy game to just drop onto and play for a few hours without having to put too much thought into it. If I very loosely compare it to a more well-beloved RPG, like Baldur's Gate, it of course cannot stack up. However, there was a simplicity to everything here that was addictive, and everything sort of just worked without having to overthink it. You passively get stronger over time without having to worry about skill points or talents. Weapon upgrades were just straight upgrades. There's no need to min-max and optimize yourself. You just play the game and go with what feels right. You aren't worried about upsetting companions or completing side quests. You have a single-minded goal, and all paths led to that one goal. Sometimes it's nice to just play a game where the lines between good and evil are clearly drawn, where the good guy always wins, and the hero can just be a hero. Crusaders was a simple and short experience, and it won't be finding its way onto any best-of lists, but it was enough to draw me in and give me a few wonderful nights exploring a new world, and that's good enough for me. See you in the next video.